I would like to thank Dr. Jeremy James from IRASEC for having invited me to give this speech, introductive speech, to attend this conference. The first observation is that in the current Anthropocene era, where Earth systems are becoming less predictable and non-stationary as a result of the global human imprint, human rights perform a singular mediating role in the human-environment interface. According to the US professor of law, Louis Scott, the recent mushrooming of rights to a healthy environment, environmental-related procedural rights, and other substantive political and socio-economic rights bearing on environmental interests, is testimony of the increasing popularity. The fact that the constitutional rights or constitutional provisions of more than 100 countries refer to a healthy environment supports this observation. To take a few examples about Southeast Asia, the latest constitution of the Kingdom of Thailand, promulgated in 2017, declared that a person and community shall have the right to manage, maintain, and utilize natural resources, environment, and biodiversity in a balanced and sustainable manner, in accordance with the procedures as provided by law. For its part, the Constitution of the Republic of Philippines, issued in 1987, enacts that the state shall protect and advance the right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology in accord with the rhythm and harmony of nature. Last example, the Constitution of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, issued in 1992, Chapter 2, Article 43, provides that every person shall have the right to life in a fresh environment and has a duty to protect the environment. It adds in its Chapter 3, Article 63, the state has a policy to protect the environment, manages and effectively and stably use natural resources, protect the nature and biodiversity, take initiative in prevention and resistance against natural calamities and response to climate change. At a global level, let us mention the United Nations Declaration of 28 July 2022, according to which everyone on the planet has a right to a healthy environment. It should be said that this landmark decision was a result of decades of mobilizations of various stakeholders. According to the British professor of law, Alan Boyle, these environmental rights can be viewed from at least three perspectives. In the first one, existing civil and political rights are used to give individuals, groups, and NGOs access to environmental information, judicial remedies, and political processes. This approach is one of empowerment, facilitating participation in environmental decision-making and compelling governments to meet minimum standards of protection for life and property from environmental harm. For example, the French Charter for the Environment, which was added in 2005 to the preamble of the Constitution of 1958, enacts that everyone has a right, in the conditions and to the extent provided for by the law, to have access to information pertaining to the environment in the possession of public bodies and to participate in the public decision-taking process likely to affect the environment. The second approach consists in treating a decent and healthy environment as an economic and social right. Thailand's and Philippines' constitutions provide a good illustration of this approach, whose main argument is that it privileges environmental quality as a value, giving it comparable status to other social and economic rights. As for the third option, it treats environmental quality as a collective or solidarity right, giving communities or nations, rather than individuals, a right to determine how their environment and natural resources should be protected and managed. At a national level, this approach applies, for example, to the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, whose amendment introduced in 1982 enacted that the state protect the environment and natural resources and prevent and eliminate pollution and other hazards to the public. Alan Boyle explained that the first approach is the most anthropocentric, insofar as it focuses on the harmful impact on individuals rather than on the environment itself. In his words, it amounts to a breeding of human rights law rather than a law of environmental rights. The second comes closer to seeing the environment as a good in its own right. Nevertheless, one that will always be vulnerable to trade-offs against other similarly but competing objectives, including the right to economic development. As for the third approach, it is the most contested because lawyers argue that it devalues the concept of human rights and diverts attention from the need to implement existing civil, political, economic, and social rights fully. Whatever the differences, this approach shares some common features and the same flaws. First, they remain entrenched in the hegemonic ideological framework of neoliberalism, with a focus on ideas of individual freedom, material development, economic growth, and consumerism as intrinsic conditions of human welfare. This utilitarian way of thinking about the relationship to the environment threatens the living order, partly due to its ignorance of natural limits. Conor Gertie explained that in such configuration, human rights provide the justificatory basis for complete human mastery over the world. They also create individual entitlements instead of duties, thus countering efforts that seek to foster greater harmonious interdependence between humans and the other beings living on Earth. The sustainable development paradigm does not escape this bias insofar as it recognizes ecological concerns only when they do not inhibit justifiable socio-economic development. The neoliberal framework has of course an impact on the conceptual problematization of ecological issues. The French lawyer Nadia Belaidi highlights the mercantile semantics that are used in international bodies and scholarly constructs to think about environmental rights. Compounds such as climate negotiation, biodiversity management, negotiated emission permits, carbon credit, contractual agreement, or ecological debt are good indicators of the deep influence of the neoliberal doxa. They contribute to move environmental rights away from the protection of social and ecological values and towards a commercial and financial approach. Second, an anthropocentric formulation of environmental rights stems from the core foundation of human rights. That is to say, human rights are concerned with the human and with the rights from being human. In this perspective, the promotion and protection of human dignity through material well-being is seen at the core of human rights, which is mostly achieved through increasing economic security and increased extractive and consumption activities. Human rights are also individual-centered. They only apply to those individuals who have been harmed. For example, the rights of the European Court of Human Rights are available only to those affected. Consequently, they reject complaints brought by NGOs or citizens groups as long as they are not directly involved in the environmental damage. Tim Hayward points out that the European Convention still falls short of guaranteeing the right to a decent or satisfactory environment if that concept is understood in broader, essentially qualitative terms unrelated to impact on humans. It doesn't provide general protection to the environment as such. Third, from an academic point of view, the human rights and environment discourse is mostly monodisciplinary. to date, human rights have been the exclusive domains of law and social sciences, and there remains a deep divide between the social world, as depicted by social sciences, and the material world of engineering and natural sciences. The result is that the potential utility of human rights is diluted for the sake of reality, where natural science will probably play an increasing dominant role in broader regulatory effort. Fourth, from the point of view of their implementation, the operation of human rights continues to be seriously restricted by state borders and sovereignty, which results in fragmented protection of individual interests in specific countries rather than a more holistic approach. Likewise, the preservation of large ecosystems suffers from the lack of unified international regulations able to transcend national legislations. For now, there is no universally accepted treaty regarding the global protection of the biosphere. After 20 years of negotiations, the United Nations Treaty on the Creation of Marine Protected Areas, which is due to come into force in early 2026, has only been ratified by 63 countries. Among the major countries that have not ratified the treaty are the United States, China, Russia, and Japan. As for the 2015 climate agreement of the COP21, it is not universally implemented, and the targets it sets are not binding. There is also a considerable gap between the commitments made and their implementation. Thus, the United Nations Environment Report of 2019 finds that despite a 38-fold increase in environmental laws put into place since 1972 and the first United Nations Summit of the Earth, failure to fully implement and enforce these laws is one of the greatest challenges to mitigating climate change, reducing pollution, and preventing widespread species and habitat loss. Even worse, some governments of major countries, like the Trump administration, are denouncing such treaties by denying against all evidence any environmental loss and climate crisis. This situation clearly means that human rights and the international governance are unlikely to be able, on the present construction, to respond efficiently to the interconnected nature of the myriad intertwined concerns that the Anthropocene raises. Given the scale of the climate and environmental crisis and the vital urgency of addressing it, the above-mentioned defects cannot clearly be satisfied by solutions in terms of political or management engineering aimed at making more effective the implementation of existing models. They imply a more radical change of philosophical and ethical direction. The question is, should we continue to think about human rights and the environment within the existing framework in which the protection of human is the central focus? Or should we come to talk directly about environmental rights? Facing this challenge, some researchers in law and human sciences suggest moving towards more balanced human-environment rights. Based on the observation that the future of life on Earth depends closely on safeguarding ecological resources, they advocate a shift from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism. That is to say, an ideology which emphasizes the intrinsic value of nature. In this perspective, and to become ecologically responsible, human rights will have to redefine the individual freedom they seek to protect. According to Louis Koze, human rights have to move towards something more grounded in communal and group conception of rights that extend well beyond individual freedom. This proposal implicitly recognizes that human rights and environmental rights may intertwine differently from one society to another, even when these rights seek to reconcile human dignity and respect for nature in full convergence. To express this unity of purpose through a plurality of socio-cultural needs, Nadia Belaidi speaks of universal human rights. The options I advocate has successfully been implemented for centuries at local and small scale by communities of hunter-gatherers and slash-and-burn agriculturists from all continents. These groups limit the freedom of individuals through a wide range of rules and prohibitions in order to maintain advantageous transactions with Mother Earth and the being who inhabit it. The French anthropologist Philippe Descola has shown that these rules and taboos find their justification in holistic cosmologies and monist ontologies which attribute comparable spiritual properties to humans and other beings, thus enabling interspecific transactions via religious ritual in order to guarantee the material prosperity of the living. In other words, rather than opposing culture to nature in the name of human exclusive rationalism, they subordinate the human condition to a mutual benefit partnership with the forces of nature. In a way, their cosmocentrism has prefigured the ecocentrism recommended today by Western researchers and activists. Ecocentrism is gradually gaining ground in resolutions taken by national and international bodies. Thus, in December 2010, Bolivia's Legislative Assembly passed the law to the rights of Mother Earth. This law recognizes that Earth is a living entity and as a result states that Mother Earth and all things of which she is composed would lay claim to the full range of fundamental rights normally attributed to humans, including, among others, the right to life and regeneration of its biocapacity, the right to be respected, or the right to not have its genetic structure modified or disrupted. The following year, this declaration was presented by Bolivia in the United Nations Interactive Dialogues on Harmony with Nature. Some scholarly constructs attempt to orient scientific analysis in this direction too. In the philosophical field, we can mention the so-called anti-speciesist movement, whose leading figures are the Canadian philosophers Hugh Donaldson and Will Kimlicka. In their book entitled Zoopolis, these authors advocate the advent of a new form of trans-specific democracy where sentient animals will have the same rights to life, well-being and dignity as humans. These ideas are also infusing civil society through the emergence of activist movements that fight against natural animal exploitation and mistreatment, but also through vegan consumption patterns. As another scholarly construct, we can mention the actor network theory of Michel Calon and Bruno Latour, as well as the symmetrical anthropology program developed by the latter. Their aim is to broaden sociological analysis to networks of interaction involving men, animals, and objects. Latour also advocates a democracy that includes all of these actors on an equal footing. On the life science side, the One Health initiative should be mentioned. In 1984, the North American epidemiologist Calvin Schwab coined the term One Medicine, which was reformulated in the early 2000s in One Health. The purpose of this initiative is to correlate human, animals, and biotope health, to prevent more efficiently sanitary risks, to protect biodiversity, and to better manage environmental crises. The concept was progressively adopted by the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Health Organization. The first symposium, One World on Health, was organized in 2004 by the Rockefeller University. This product, called the Manhattan Principles, lists 12 recommendations for establishing a more holistic approach to preventing epidemic or episodic disease and for maintaining ecosystem integrity. To conclude now, a major impediment to widespread adoption of this new approach is insufficient awareness of consumers and governments of the services that nature provides to humans. Certainly, this awareness occurs sporadically during crises or disasters, but even in these circumstances, it is still very limited in the face of the prevailing individualism and the consumerist logic of the neoliberal economic model which reigns supreme. If the notion of commons is hotly debated in international arenas today, it's because even resources that were previously freely accessible, such as air and water, are now threatened with privatization, or because the pollution opposes the satisfaction of the most basic human rights. As long as humanity doesn't realize that nature is a heritage to be passed on to future generations, and not immediate capital to be made to bear fruit for private hands, and that the good life is antinomic to growth taken as an end in itself, there is little chance that we will escape the predicted climatic and ecological disaster. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for keeping us awake after lunch, showing that not only there are those challenges, which I think obviously are very real, but there is an enormous amount of existing scholarship and research. And so partly I think it's working out how we can use some of that going forward. So again, thank you very much for that great keynote address. So we're now going to move on to our next speakers. And our first speaker, Catherine Baron, Professor from Sciences Po Toulouse.
Thank you. It was a very good transition because I'm going to discuss about the commons. So thank you for your contribution. Okay, so I'm Catherine Baron. I'm professor at the Political Science Institute of Toulouse, working on water governance issues in the global south, mainly in Africa and Indonesia also. And for the last 2 years, doing some field work with Mali, who is here in Thailand. So I'm an economist from the start, socio-economist, but working more on development studies and urban issues also from the water governance part. So I wanted to talk about the rights of nature in relation with water commoning, and also trying to discuss with you. So but I will be very brief because this has already been discussed. But in fact, the rights of nature movement is to be seen in the context of socio-ecological transition, especially according to water issues, because there is a big crisis, as you mentioned already, in Thailand, but in many other countries, in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa. There is also a more than human ontological turn with the issue of multi-species justice, kinship, knowledge co-creation, all these issues which have been discussed a lot. And also all these debates about the recognition of the rights of nature with legal and institutional mechanisms coming at different scales from the civil society point of view, but also international institutions, as mentioned this morning. So the rights of nature in the global south is recognizing that more than human concerns are very important, but through legal tools. And on water issue, it very often focuses on rivers and the rights of rivers. I will talk about that later. So in Europe, you have the first recognition of Mar Menor Lagoon in Spain, but also a lot of experiences very interesting in France in the last few years, like the Parlement de la Loire, Assemblée populaire du Rhône, les gardiennes de la Seine, with a specific contextual challenges. I will discuss about that. So I think that what is interesting is that there is a shift from the right to get access to safe water for humans. This was the UN declaration in 2010, to a new debate on the rights of water, but mainly the rights of rivers, I will mention. So I just wanted to show you that there is an economic concern with an interdisciplinary perspective We took Web of Science and Google Scholar to show all the publication on these issues in the last few years. So you can see on the figure, and from many different disciplines, but mainly in. Sorry, I'm sorry. I think it's not very clear, but especially in social sciences, and we wanted to show that in public policies, anthropologists, and also law, but law is not the main discipline. There were a lot of publication in the last few years. So what is new with these rights of nature, and what are the new kind of topics which are discussed? The first one is that, you mentioned this already, recognizing rights or legal personality for ecosystems or elements of nature. And it's a constitutional, legislative, judicial, and also administrative decision. So this is the more institutional arrangements for governance, but it's legal personality coming from recognizing rights or formalizing rights. The second one, and I think it's quite interesting, is a way to contest the vision of ecosystem as property, individual property, or also as nature that provides services, so more in terms of externalities. For instance, we have all this literature on payment for ecosystemic services, who are a more utilitarist vision of environment. The third one is that, as I mentioned, social mobilizations were very important, so global struggle, and there's all this discourse against extractivism and also corporate power. So how to counter power of these different actors. What was also interesting, I found in the literature, is that this rights of nature movement was in line with post-humanist and indigenous critics, emphasizing more on relational considerations and non-human agency. So it was supposed, as you mentioned also, to be a shift from an anthropocentric to a more ecocentric approach. But in fact, I did a little literature review to see and try to figure out what are the limits of this rights of nature approach. The first one, as I mentioned this morning, is the kind of ambiguity in defining nature. What is nature? Nature is very often idealized, and very often it obscures the complexity of the living, of human, non-human relationships. And also it's sometimes denied the aspect of the human altered environments. So as we don't know what is water in this kind of rights of nature, I think that there are also a lot of work to do more on discussing nature as we did this morning. For instance, for water, there is no rights. When we say the rights of the rivers, we don't discuss, in fact, the rivers. We consider water as a whole, but we don't consider the flowing of the water. We don't consider the banks. We don't consider all the complexity. So we just talk about the rights of water, of rivers. So this is one of the issues that is discussed in literature also. There is also, as you know, the implementation failure. So I will not discuss more, but there's also some papers showed, and I found it very interesting, a kind of risk of appropriation and simplification of indigenous knowledge by the state, meaning that when you recognize the rights of nature or of water, sometimes you simplify the reality. So this can be also an issue to discuss. And there is also a kind of, I think, maybe danger to consider this movement of rights of nature as a new, what we call traveling model, meaning that you can import legal solution from other countries, but sometimes it doesn't fit with the realities and history and even institutional context of these countries. So just to be sure that we are not trying to reproduce the same everywhere in the world. And also, rights of nature very often transcend liberal legal categories as property, as I mentioned, but they do not transcend the human-centered ontological assumption that structure modern law. You discussed this morning of personhood, which is juridical personality. Even the words that we are using are very anthropocentric. So it's not only words, an issue of words. Huh? It's much more than this. It's a representation that we have of nature. So what could be the future perspective for this rights of nature movement? First one is and this is the most difficult part for me, to recognize the independence of social and environmental justice, meaning that there cannot be sustainable environmental protection without justice for human communities, because very often it goes with the exclusion of some communities. So, and sometimes, as shown in the literature, especially with Fitzhenry, limits of more than human-centered approaches, which sometimes overshadow struggles of marginalized people. So how is there a hierarchy between the two, and how do we manage this issue? The second one, we discussed this in the group also, it's to expand alliances beyond ecologists and technical experts. Meaning, how do we engage with social justice, with indigenous movements, but also anti-racist labor movements, and for a broader legitimacy and impact. We discussed also this in our group to support indigenous sovereignty, which is also really a political dimension of this, which is sometimes underestimated. And also the idea of promoting strong solidarity and trying to handle disagreements rather than erasing them. Meaning that there are conflicts, but these conflicts exist, and trying not to undermine. So in fact, make power relationships visible. So in order to do so, I think that there may be very interesting inputs on the recent literature on water commoning. I will not, 3 minutes, okay? So I will go very quick. As you know, the literature on the commons, water at the commons, was very famous with the work of Elinor Ostrom, who had the Nobel Prize and all this. She did a lot of work on water issues, but today, in many scholars criticize her approach and refer to commoning instead of the commons. Commoning is more interesting because it goes beyond resource management to focus more on the social, political, and relational practices that sustain the commons. So I don't have time to explain, so I can answer all the questions if you want. So there's a lot of literature on commoning, and it has been popularized, especially from the activist way by David Boyer and Silke Elfrich, which are a lot used in the literature for the activist approach, but also some sociologists, especially in France, who emphasizes on the fact that commoning is more a democratic practice with a more philosophical and political approach in relation with self-organization, but discussing the link with the state, meaning that these are more autonomous movements with no relation with the state. So there is a lot of literature and discussion on this idea these days. Just to finish maybe, so are there some experiences here in Asia and in Thailand, for instance, that try to have this kind of approach, different approach in terms of commoning and in relation, of course, with what we are talking about, meaning the rights of nature. I think that the work that is doing in Thailand research by Chayan, Vandalaputi and Mali, and especially the book that Mali published, which is called Cultural Mapping, is very interesting for this, from this point of view, because it's focused on epistemic justice and knowledge co-creation, making local knowledge visible and acknowledge it as being equally legitimate as technical knowledge, which is very dominant in water studies. It also considers the relationship between local people and their ecosystems, rivers, but not only nature. It's really a more specific interactions. And also it gives tools for sensitive approaches, combining science, art, experience-based knowledge, which is also very important. And once you can recognize this new way of creating knowledge, then you can think about innovative modes of governance, but not the thinking governance before knowledge, which is very often. And just as I told you, there is this experience in France that I found very interesting to discuss, not time, but I could come back on this issue, which is a more territorialized cultural approach, transdisciplinary coalition, with institutional experimentations with Guardian and all this, combining commoning and rights of nature, and a lot of discussion these days on this kind of experiences, which is for me very close to the one that my colleagues from Chiang Mai universities developed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Dayoon Kim is our next presenter, who is a research associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is located just downstairs. So please, Dayoon. And I think, you know, for me, coming from Australia, one of the things when I moved to Thailand was just the power, the cultural presence of the Mekong River. And I think that is something that we all, you know, understand, and certainly in Australia, the challenges over the issues with the Murray-Darling Basin for management and the fights to get even some environmental flows really created so much tension and discussion because it was almost heretical at the beginning, but it does move on. Dayoon, 15 minutes, is that?
Yeah,
okay?
sounds good.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Dayoon Kim. I'm a research associate from Stockholm Environment Institute, Asia office. So we're located in Thailand, actually 10th floor of this building. So yeah, I want to present today on ongoing research by SEI on rights of nature, especially focused on rights of river in Bangladesh. So I do think there will be a lot of overlap with the previous presenter, Kathleen. So I would try to summarize some parts and while expanding on other parts. So just to explain a bit more on this project, it's a very short-term project starting from this March until next year, February. And we're specifically looking at the implementation of the rights of river judgment in 3 countries, Bangladesh, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Colombia. So, but then for this presentation, I'll be only presenting on Bangladesh. So this is the structure of the presentation, first giving a bit more overview of the study framing on rights of nature and rights of river, and our preliminary finding from Bangladesh, and conclusion and next steps of the research. And again, please note that this is an ongoing study and we still have some process to further refine our analysis, and hopefully our discussion can also help that process as well. Great. So I will just keep this part very short on what's rights of nature. And as we were discussing a lot on how do we define nature, I think there's a lot of definitions out there on rights of nature as well. But just to really emphasize that it is a concept that recognizes nature has rights like humans, and it is actually not a new concept for indigenous peoples communities especially, but in the context of Western jurisprudence, let's say last 2 decades, we saw more of emerging cases globally, and it would be recognizing the specific ecosystems to entire jurisdictions. So earlier presenters also mentioned about recognition of rights of nature in constitutions. So those are kind of the different characteristics how the rights of nature has been recognized all across different countries. And the next slide, please. So what is the significance of the rights of nature? Again, I do not want to repeat what others have already talked about, but we also know that a lot of the crises that we are facing are far from normal, and the rights of nature movement and laws are kind of emerging as a part of social and legal reform to uphold the well-being of nature, and also in connection with the well-being of humans to address these crises. And human rights and rights in nature, although they come from very different traditions, they have different right holders. So earlier, Ron Chat has been explaining how they cannot include each other, but they are definitely a reinforcing actor. And just to cite a case from Inter-American Court of Human Rights, where they have cited the Atrato River case of Colombia, they emphasize that the human right to a healthy environment protects all the components of environment like forests, rivers, ocean, and others as a legal end in itself. So there has been some recognition of the relations between the rights of nature as well as the right to a healthy environment. Next slide, please. Yes. So for our study at SCI, we looked specifically at rights of rivers. And also how those recognition of rights of river are translated into practice. So we can say that it's implementation mechanisms, and it is in a way that given the rights of nature in the Western jurisprudence is relatively new if we compare to, let's say, right to health environment. We also see a lot of new mechanisms such as the guardianship arrangements that are emerging together with the rights of nature and rights of river recognition. And we do see a gap in how people are examining certain rights of river cases in terms of how does that link with the river governance, especially existing river governance, into context of very complex environmental policies and environmental politics, in a sense. So we wanted to gather some evidence looking at 3 countries, so Bangladesh, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Colombia, and to inform how efforts by different actors are shaping policies and practices towards the more just and equitable governance, and how rights of river should be understood in that context. So we conducted literature reviews since March this year, and we have supplemented some interviews this year as well, and from government actors, NGO actors, academia. And in the context of Colombia, the colleagues there at SCI Latin America Center was able to interview some local communities who are living across the River. Next slide, please. So just to give a context of rights of river in Bangladesh, so in 2019, the High Court Division of the Bangladesh Supreme Court granted the legal personhood to all rivers in the country. So it was not just Tura River that got recognized, but it was all rivers in the country that received quote-unquote the legal personhood. And this decision actually stemmed from a public interest litigation filed by an NGO to protect the Tura River from encroachment, constructions, and earth fillings. And the petitioners relied on the doctrine of public trust, where the state protects the environment for the public use, as well as the constitutional right to a healthy environment of the Bangladeshi Constitution, so Article 18A. And the court made a judgment saying that they grant the legal personhood to the Turak River as well as to all rivers in the country, and also appointed the National River Conservation Commission, NRCC, as the legal guardian of the Turak River, which means that NRCC will be kind of representing and also to advocate the rights of the river. And the ruling issued some detailed directives, such as mandates to prevent encroachment and mandates to prevent pollution, treat some river grabbing and pollutions issues as criminal issue, as well as holding some violators accountable. And just to understand a bit more on the Turak River, so Turak River is actually located near Dhaka, the capital city, so it's quite vulnerable to pollution as well as the commercial interests. And there has been many urban restoration efforts, including encroachment and eviction of the communities, which is contributing to the territorialization of the river. I think previous speakers have talked about that concept, where given that there's a demarcation of the river, the communities based in the river will be displaced, and also their livelihoods and their knowledge are basically displaced as well from the planning and conservation of the river. And last but not least, just want to highlight that in the context of Bangladesh, some scholars have been identifying that the human rights to water are in conflict with conservation and in conflict with rights of nature in its entirety, because in many Southeast Asian and South Asian contexts, the control over natural resources on its river and water bodies reflect a very anthropocentric and economic development model. So there's a very strong emphasis on the fair and equitable sharing of water resources, and therefore there is a strong conflict with making the rights of river as a reality. Next slide, please. So I will share 3 preliminary findings. Again, I hope our team can refine these better in the upcoming months. But first is that there is a very complex barrier for the guardian, the NRCC, to implement and to enforce any river protection and rights of river protection mechanism. So there's operational and financial barriers. So there's 1,400 plus rivers in Bangladesh that's recognized by the states, and then NRCC have 48 officers, which is a very small number of people who are under this agency. And the commission, the NRCC's annual budget as of 2022 was only 400,000 USD. So you can see that there's a lot of limitations as to what they can do as part of their agency's work. And not just that, there's a very inherent limitations to how NRCC works. So they do not have an enforcement mechanism, and they only functions as a regulatory and advisory body to other agencies. What it means is that they often recommend actions to other relevant government agencies. So they will be sending letters to the other government ministries, such as Water Development Board, with recommendations for actions. And whether those actions are taken or not is not in control of NRCC. So you can see how much it can do. So there's a barriers to implementing some of the protections if they only have this advisory role. Another thing was that NRCC is a government body under Ministry of Shipping, and they are trying their best, I guess, in a way to make themselves an independent agency from the other agencies in order to strengthen their power. So there was a draft act to strengthen this agency in 2020, but it was struck down on appeal, and there's no update as of 2025. And actually, the Churag River judgment included a directive to strengthen the NRCC's operations, but it was also not considered and not followed up. And last but not least, as I mentioned earlier on this anthropocentric and economic development focused approach, there is a fundamental conflict on how rights of river can be understood from the perspective of ecology and from the perspective of more the human relationship, given a lot of bureaucratic involvement and how a lot of the agents within these institutions are coming from, let's say, water management professions, flood professions, and in a way that there's ontological barriers to making rights of river as a reality. Just to give a very short second point, next slide please, which is the narrow definition of rights. So within the Churag River decision, it was very much emphasized that protection of the rights of river equals protection from encroachment, but not something else. So as you see in the rights of nature, there are a lot of different aspects of substantive elements that needs to be also mentioned, such as right to flow, right to regenerate, and right to feed into its sustainable aquifers. However, in the Churag River case, such elements were not mentioned, and that becomes as critical barriers to critical barriers for the rights of river to be more holistic and comprehensive. And then I'll move on to the last point, which is, I think, the most interesting for the discussion, which is the lack of inclusion of the local and local communities and the indigenous peoples in this decision. So there was basically lack of reflection of the historical importance and embodied experience of the riverine communities within the decisions. And actually, the decision also failed to include these groups as part of the guardianship body, so it only has the NRCC as a sole guardian, sole representative, which contrasts with Colombia and which contrasts with New Zealand cases. I know that the time is up. So I guess there are some practical entry points for the integration of local knowledge and local voices, which I would guess that it's quite similar to the points that was shared earlier, and other colleagues have a lot to contribute more, so I hope we can do that during the discussion. And I guess the next point is on encroachment. Again, let's bring this to the discussion instead. And next slide, please. So as a next step of our research, we'll be further analyzing these outcomes and then create a draft case study report in January and publish some case study reports and disseminate the results. And as part of the discussion, I wanted to see if we can have a discussion on what can be some alternative models that's feasible for Bangladesh. It could be enhancing certain aspects of NRCC, or it could be a different model that could be proposed. But of course, in a way that this is something that we need to see what's the feasibility in the local context of Bangladesh, also given the political transition that's happening in Bangladesh as of planned election in February next year. So more to discuss, and thanks a lot for listening, and thank you so much. I hope to have more discussions.
Thank you, Dayoon. Julien, Claude is our next speaker. And I will give you the nod at 13 and finally at 15. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I am a biologist, so I'm not from the side of social science or anthropology, and I may speak more about the things that I see on the field, I would say, as a watcher. as a watcher of nature, but also as a watcher for biodiversity. The bird you have here is, I would say, a famous bird. In Europe, this is the Ortolan bunting. And the story of the Ortolan bunting shows that there is sometimes a problem when you are at the interaction of human rights and rights of nature. This is a widespread bird, and actually there is no classification at the IUCN telling that this bird is threatened, vulnerable, or endangered. But this bird is migrating, and it is migrating from Europe to Africa. And during the migration of the bird has a problem. It has to pass France. And in France, there are some tradition and culinary tradition. And you probably know that people were having Ortolan bunting, so they met, and after for 2 weeks, the bird was first fed feed to be very, very thick, and once it was finished, after 2 weeks, we were drowning the bird in Armagnac, so which is a very strong alcohol to kill the bird, and after to cook it. So this is an old tradition, so it was very, I would say, it was a big problem for the League of Protection of Birds in Thailand, because France was taking more birds that it had on the territory. So in France, we have about 15,000 couples, and every year this kind of activity take up 30,000 birds from nature. So France was partially participating to the decline of the population with this kind of practice. So you see that you have a ritual when you are eating the bird. You hide your face with this kind of napkin for not being seen by God, because you are doing a sin. You are doing a sin, and so the sin is because you are eating probably a delicacy, but the sin is also because you are destroying nature. So there was a long discussion between people who want to protect the tradition, who want to protect a kind of autochthone culinary right, and I would say activists, nature activists for a long time. Unfortunately, Europe was helping, because in plenty of countries, this bird, you cannot hunt it. It is not in the Hunting Act. So in 1999, there was the first law, and so the law was completely enforced in France, and step by step. So after 2016, I think, so now it's totally illegal if you are catching a bird, or if you are eating a bird, the fine is high, this is 6,000 euros. But even so, people are still enforcing the law. Okay, so in France, you should know that we are allowed to hunt 90 wildlife species. This is not a very so good, because if you compare France with other countries, we are very, we allow plenty of species to be hunted. Some species have absolutely no culinary values. You can see that we can hunt the weasel. We are also hunting species that are problematic because they are migratory species. So meaning that these species are protected in some countries, but they are not protected in France. So there is a problem because the law in France is evolving with the different lobbies, and the hunting lobbies is a very important lobby. So some of these species are actually classified by the IUCN as threatened, like the common pochard, for instance, in Europe. So the discussion is always a little bit the same when we discuss with hunter lobbies, and they say that if you look at the global scale, that species has no problem, because the IUCN did not classify it at the global scale as endangered or something like this. But the advantage of the EU is that we are a local royalist. And these local royalists help us to understand what are the trends at the local side. So you may know another story in France that is animating a lot of debate. Actually, this is the problem of the wolf. The wolf was completely disappearing in France at the beginning of the 20th century, and it is coming back. So this is not the same subspecies. The subspecies that is coming back is the one coming from Italy. And you may see very important lobbying for allowing to hunt the wolf. The wolf was fully protected by the European Commission last 2 years, but since last year the protected statuship was decreasing, and now people can kill dangerous wolf. So there is a lot of debate on internet, so petitionists, activists, but also hunter, agriculture are speaking a lot, and this is a problem because here we have a conflict for the law protecting the animal and the law protecting human rights. So what about Southeast Asia? In Southeast Asia, it is illegal to hunt in Thailand, for instance. And the hunt is completely banned since the revision of the Wildlife Conservation and Protection Act that was done in 2019. So there was already an act in 1992, and it is prohibiting the hunt of vertebrates. So it is very ambitious. This is very ambitious because unlike France, so people were using animals as a subsistence, as a true subsistence. It was not a sport, it was not fun, it was not just a tradition. And it was also very necessary. You probably know that kind of report that was published by the World Wide Fund. So this is our Living Planet Index. So this is showing how diversity, how population of vertebrates are decreasing in the world. And you can see that some places are more monitored than others. In Southeast Asia, there are very few data, and we don't know too much about the decrease of biodiversity in this place, but it's probably dramatic. So the Living Planet Index, who is measuring this, tells you that more than 55% of the population in the world are decreasing. In some countries, and this is not so important, but in some other group of countries, for instance, like South America, so the decrease can be very dramatic. So there was no estimates for Southeast Asia. I tried to produce one with a few data that was provided by the World Foundation and the Zoological Society. And the number we get for the whole Southeast Asia is that more than 92% of vertebrate population are declining. So this is very important, and this is a big concern when you study wildlife, because you see it less and less on the field. So just a few points. So we have seen elephants, we probably have seen tiger, but we should remember that there was a lot more of biodiversity in the past in Southeast Asia and continental Southeast Asia. And just to remind you that Thailand was also the land of rhino. So the last wild rhino in Thailand was get extinct some more than 10 years ago. In Malaysia was a few years ago. And now rhinoceros are just living in Indonesia with very, very small population, so 70 individuals for the Sumatran species, 70 for the Javanese one. So this is an illustration of the first exploration of the Mekong, and what you can see in the background, this is the Sumatran rhino. And if you look behind the Sumatran rhino, you will see other rhinos that shows that rhino were abundant at that time. So, and in less than 200 years, so the rhino completely disappeared. If you speak to the new generation of rhinoceros, to Thai scholars, they would say, we don't know. We never get rhino in Thailand. Just because they forget, we forget. If time goes, we forget. So, yes, it was very important to make an act in Thailand. Why it was important? Just because probably that there was already problems with elephants, with ivory, but not only this. Every time that you have something exceptional, so rhino horns, so you have a business. And I would like to speak about another business. This is the ivory made from a bird, and it's a special bird. And this bird is undergoing very high pressure. So this is emitted hornbill. Just to give you a number, there are less than 100 emitted hornbill who are surviving in Thailand. We have absolutely no idea about the number remaining in Indonesia, but it's dramatically decreasing because the bird is poaching, for producing this kind of jewelry. So this is the hornbill ivory. And the bird is classified as critically endangered. So if you want to know a little bit, so National Geographic was releasing a very good documentary about that bird and the problem of poacher. So it's a big problem because this bird will disappear. So laws and fact. So actually the laws is working well in Thailand, but if you look at the newspaper nearly every year, so the police, the rangers, they arrest poacher in the forest. You can see here this very sad picture with 2 tigers. So just to give you another number, there are less than 250 tigers in the wild in Thailand. In Laos they disappear, in Cambodia they disappear already. But there is something different, I would say, than the wolf story in France. In France you can kill the wolf. In Thailand, even if animals create very big damage, so last 3 months I was in Phu Viong National Park, and if you have seen the news, there was a big problem with 3 elephants that were leaving the group of Phuwa in Deuil and decided to go in Conquer and to establish not very far from the National Park of Phu Viong, but they were not wishing to enter the park. They were roaming in the village. And so some people, because they probably didn't know that the elephants were so dangerous, tried to get the elephant far away. So two men were killed in 2 or 3 days interval. The elephant were not killed. So the Department of Nature, the DNP in Thailand, tried to relocate the elephant. It's still a problem because the elephant doesn't want to cooperate. But it shows that nature can have right and that this right can be equal to human. So another act that is very important in Thailand, and I think that we have also to work on this act. This is the problem of the act regarding cruelty and Animal Provision Act. Of course, this act has made progress in Thailand, but there are still human conflict interaction. This picture is a kind of sad picture that you can see around Bangkok. So around Bangkok, near the shore, so you have a lot of fish farms, shrimp farms, and above the fish farms and shrimp farms, so you have a complicated network of hooks that are hidden by a transparent string. And when the bird goes to the pond to feed, so they get hooked and they die. So it takes more than 1 or 2 days for the bird to die. People keep blind even if you get a look. So this is what you can see on the field as a tourist, just as a bird watcher from me. So things are fortunately evolving, and it is evolving thanks to the monitoring of biodiversity in Thailand. So I am lucky to be hosted by Chulalongkorn University here because Chulalongkorn University was a university that was hosting the 5-year event when we do the Thai Red List. And the Thai Red List is a complementary list than the IUCN Red List. So you see that, so we have the international agreement, this passed via the Ministry of Environmental and Natural Resources, then Office of Natural Resources on Environmental Policy and Planning, and finally this group are mandating a group of experts, usually national group of experts, to make the assessment. So we are not paid to go on the field by this group. There is no money for that. This is based on our knowledge. And this is how it works. So each panel of experts is working in a small group. So here you have an idea about the bird expert, about 10 people for the whole Thailand. We had to examine more than 1,000 species in less than 1 day. 1,000 species in less than 1 day, just to make the So I can tell you that these days are very, very long days. The group working on fish had to examine 3,000 species because we are in a very biodiverse place. And how people do? The problem of Southeast Asia is that you have few monitoring because you have a lot of biodiversity and few experts. We try to extrapolate, we try to guess. But even with this case, we can obtain good results. And what I would like to show to you is a few data that came from that last edition of the Redist we made. So just to speak about something associated with this Redist. So last month I was along the Mekong, and you may see two different species of birds. So these two birds are protected birds. So the river loping and the great Whitney. It is important to understand that populations are disconnected from each other. So something that sometimes you may not see in international report because, sorry to come back, people are extrapolating. So you think that the range is continuous. The range is never continuous when you have a wildlife species. And this is why it's important to have a reflection at a more local scale to try to refine a little bit the things. And this is what is good with the Thai Redist. It's because we can refine the things that were from the IUCN. Another tool to refine this is citizen participatory science, but I may not speak about this because we are a little bit short. So just come back to this bird. When you go on the field, and you may see evidence. So you may see evidence of bird, but you also may see evidence of poaching and hunting. It was the same day, so I was very happy because I saw 10 birds, but I saw one day. So I was very sad because in the whole province there were probably less than 20 birds. So it's interesting to look at the discrepancies that you have at the global scale and at the national scale, just to start a dialogue at different scale. And you can see that the Thai Redist is a little bit more severe than the global assessment. So it's normal because you are working on a smaller territory, but it allows you to see things because you have local extinction. And this local extinction, you don't see them if you go at the global level because animals are not extinct yet. If you see the number of birds that are classified CR in Thailand, it's nearly 3 or 4 more times than the number of birds that are classified as CR in the global assessment. So this allows to have in practice a change in the Thai law regarding the statuship of a bird, and a little bit like in Europe for the wolf, to improve the policies. So, and I will end with a final slide. So, I think that monitoring, if you have a take-home message to keep, must integrate the different scales. So you have the global scales, you have the national scales, and I did not detail this too much. You have also the regional scale, and for me, the thinner the scale, the more efficient we can do management. So this is why sometimes national law or international treaties are not completely adapted to the protection on the field. And I like the time model because I think it may probably evolve to giving more right to the province or maybe to the temple to protect the biodiversity and recognize the biodiversity. And it might be an interesting model for ASEAN as an example with things that are working, things that are not working completely well. But it's a great advance, and I feel super proud to be in that country because I feel a little bit shame when I am in France and I see a big number of animals that we can kill for just pleasure.
Merci. Thank you, Julien. Sorry to be so tough on the time, but our last speaker, Dr. Mike Hay, is from Mahidol University. And I also found that interesting, is that one of those conclusions about moving power more to the Tambon is also something I think that's a very interesting approach about how to engage the village level of students. Lucky last.
Yeah, and I know that when you start the session after the break should even begun, or the break should have ended, you're in a rather tight position. So I'm going to try and not take too long to do this. Now, my approach here is a bit different. I've called it a strategy, but in reality, it's more like a list of complaints that I thought, when I put it down, I thought, well, talking about this kind of relationship between human rights and nature, and it just came out as a long kind of whinge. And to a certain extent, when you're an old white man, as some of us are, you get a bit whingy about these things, but I think that these are kind of important issues that we tend to forget in this relationship between human rights and nature. And so we'll go to the first slide. So the first one, I think, and this comes from an Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies, where we've kind of addressed this relationship between human rights and peace for a while. And the discussion has always been that, you know, human rights and peace are kind of in conflict, or there's some distinction between them, or there are differences. Then after a while, that conversation just stopped, and we talk about human rights and peace at the same time. And I think we're in that kind of that period of human rights and the rights to human rights and the rights to nature. We're focusing too much on the distinctions between them and not looking at the kind of connections between them. Because really it's about rights of nature and human rights, and it's not about rights of nature or human rights. That it's not so much about kind of the distinctions and the functions, or you know, the kind of disciplinary differences between these two bodies of law and protection, but it's about what they do and what they can protect. And that's where the kind of the strength of this comes. Because we can bring some value added from human rights in terms of things like the inclusive nature, in terms of concepts like interdependent, interrelated, and universal, which are very strong for both these bodies. Further, it kind of expands the scope of the rights to nature in terms of some human rights values like participation, inclusive, and being accountable. And that's the one I want to focus on is accountability, because we talk a lot about the right to nature as a sort of nice standard and concept, but not the accountability there. And that's why the next point is that I think the legality of the right to nature is not really the point. Same thing like the legality of human rights is not the main point. Sure, it's necessary, and sure, it's important, but it's not so much about what the standard is, but what it protects. We all know that all rights only have their meaning when there's a correlative duty bearer. We have to identify whose duty it is and what they should be doing. If we just focus on the standards and the rights, it's kind of meaningless. It means we know what these things are, but not what they do. And that's why I think that the focus on legality of these issues is kind of going down a wrong path, because that's not where the real conflict is in terms of human rights and the rights to nature. It's much more about protecting the laws and standards themselves. We know that law itself can be quite expensive, law itself can be quite elitist as well, and law itself is not available to all. And that's why we need to address, particularly the discussions we had today about Indigenous groups. The law is not going to be the answer there, because it's about access to the law and the protection of the law. And that leads to the third point here, and I think this point may go down quite badly, is that soft laws are defeats, are not victories. So people, when I heard about the ASEAN Declaration on the Environment, I thought, what a great misstep, what a disappointment that there wasn't a binding treaty there. But ASEAN once again has laid up its duty to the protection of people by giving a soft declaration here. And so much when it comes time to protecting the environment, we tend to go back to these soft agreements. We look at, say, the UN Guiding Principles, COP31, we're kind of taught to kind of praise the soft law that comes out of that, the non-binding agreements, when really they are defeats. It means that we couldn't get together to have a legally binding document. We couldn't protect the environment, we couldn't protect those people. And so I think that that's why we're focusing too much, or we're kind of giving too much of this, we're praising too much soft laws and the outcomes of COP and so on. Now that leads to the next one, which the real focus then is not so much about the standards, it's the violation. It's the protection that's not done. It's the duty bearers who are not taking on the responsibility. It's the accountability that it's not done. We know in terms of the rights of nature and the environment, it's business which is killing environmental defenders. The most people that die in terms of kind of protecting human rights are not human rights defenders, it's environmental defenders. People often say, well, you teach human rights, it must be dangerous. No. A dangerous degree to study in Thailand is the environment. They're the ones who go to jail, they're the ones who get killed. Human rights defenders, not the safest, but not too bad. We know that those are the ones in terms of the rights to assemble and associate. They're the ones who go to jail. Now, protesting about the environment, it's terrorism in America. Protesting about the environment, you can't do in Australia. You can't, limited in Thailand. Protesting about human rights, not too bad. But that's because the business is controlling that. The governments, I think there's a kind of complicity between the governments and the business there to take away the rights in terms of protecting the environment. And that's, in a way, coming back to the non-binding nature, it's because the only accountability we give to the business is the guiding principles, and again, non-binding. So I think that we can see there's a whole kind of slew, a whole variety of ways in which a business is avoiding the law. And it does this through things like SLAPs, strategic litigation, strategic lawsuits against people's participation. We see it being done in things like the corporate veil and transnational status, where business can avoid this. We see that business working in kind of semi-legal, corrupt situations, like the utter kind of rape of the environment that's going on in Myanmar, done by businesses, and not much can be done about that. And that's where the real concern of the rights to nature is. A business creating this violation, and there's not much to protect that. Now this comes to, and this means that the real kind of job of protection here, actually just the last point on that one, is that we never see the business CEO in jail. We never see any senior people in jail. I think human rights had the moment in the 1990s when, say, Pinochet was put on trial. I'm just reading the new book by Philip Sands about the jailing of Pinochet. And that kind of was a real turning point, showing that governments and politicians are accountable. Human rights has had that moment, but the environment hasn't. Of all the environmental destruction that's gone on, I don't know one senior business person that's gone to jail. And why is it that we're not treating these criminals the same way that we're treating leaders of countries? That leads to, there are two more points. The next one is that the real contest here is not so much about the law and the definitions, the concept over who controls the knowledge and the information there. We know with the rise of authoritarianism, the closing of civil society spaces, the attacks are on the media, the attacks are on the universities, the attacks are on the sources of information, the attacks are on knowledge. And that's where the real battle is going in terms of, even in terms of the environment. We know that climate obstructionism is kind of rampant now. We know that most kids, even whether in high school or adults at university, have been largely misinformed and disinformed about climate change, net zero goals and things like that. Even to the extent of, like, the one that I always use is, like, in Thailand has this kind of really strange, complete love affair with plastic. You can never go anywhere without something being wrapped in plastic. Even you go to buy a banana, and the banana comes in plastic. And, that why is it? Because this is fossil fuel industry. They're moving out of the fossil fuel energies into the other kind of petroleum products like plastic. And there's just no discussion about that. Plastic is seen to be clean. Plastic is seen to be good. Why do you wrap a banana in plastic? Because that whole information, which has been controlled about our knowledge of what is good, what is safe, what is healthy, is now has plastic involved in that. And that's why I think that that this control of information is the real fight. And that leads to the last one there, is that when we look at this control of information, this comes in a context of closing civil society. It comes in a context of the loss of democracy, of the rise of authoritarianism. In all countries, it comes in the rise of just plain bad government. We've seen in Thailand in the past few weeks, the floods in southern Thailand, the protests that have occurred in various countries against this government. Because we know that the stronger a government tends to be, the more authoritarian a government tends to be, the worse they are for the environment. And so there is this kind of connection between the rights to nature can only occur in countries which are democratic, and can only occur in countries where there is more freedom of expression, freedom of association. And that is not going to be in authoritarian or semi-democratic countries. And so the right to nature is just not about nature, it's about democracy, it's about participation, it's about inclusion, it's about freedom of expression, it's about respect of diversity and those things. And so it is much more than just an idea of the ecocentric world. Okay, and I'll finish that.
Well, I have to say that was a good angry white male rant, but I also thought one of the things is that it did bring a lot of the themes together. And again, it's very interesting because you were mentioning about who goes to jail, and I was thinking about the case, the Black Panther case of Premchai, who ultimately went to jail, I think, but then passed away. I think he died of ill health at the same time. But there were he was caught, the prosecution went on, he was tried, convicted, the conviction was overturned and then finally reimposed. But also the Rangers were prosecuted during that time for having exceeded their authority. And he thought, and I kept also saying to my Thai friends, well, this is one of the richest men in Thailand and one of the most powerful men in Thailand. Why don't we keep talking about this case? And they say, well, we don't talk about it anymore. And I say, but that's one of the things about criminal law, is that you need to talk about these cases to make sure that people know that there is consequences. And I think in Vietnam, where it was a Formoso case where we poisoned a whole lot of fish in coastal zone, the person who went to jail was actually the blogger who reported on this. And so we constantly see those challenges. So thank you very much for those points, because I think that they will sort of inform some of the discussion we'll have. I just spoke to Gabrielle, and I think we will have a bit of questions at the moment. And then afterwards we'll have a break and come back for the final sort of working group. It may be, because our Bhutan law students have had to go to another meeting, it may be we stay in one group and just have more of a group discussion focusing on some of the ideas of what research issues we may want to look at. Although I think one of the challenges is clearly that we've got so many really interesting ideas, and yet, you know, there may be some really interesting things that we can do, perhaps on enforcement of laws, the Thai enforcement of laws. Of course, the issue of Myanmar for me is quite personal, and the environmental consequences of disasters that are occurring because of the lack of governance. But they also just that research on these fundamental freedoms and whether a freer society where procedural rights are supported, access to information, public participation, access to justice are supported, that will lead to better environmental protection and environmental outcomes. And that's really, I think, something that's quite strong. And there was I remember a debate in 2017 after the last Thai coup, where there were some initial ideas that the Thai government was going to be more pro-environment. And there was this dispute, you know, if the Thai government as a coup government is going to be pro-environment, can it be supportive or supported? It turned out, of course, I think that point was made that no authoritarian government has actually been pro-environment. Most authoritarian governments are pro-exploitation for whatever reason or another. But of course that's also something that's interesting from a political science perspective. But I think that a lot of the research on issues, indeed even those issues about red lists, and how listing a species can have a consequence, and then that means what if they're not on the list and they ought to be, or then we don't have the data for that. So these, I think, are some of the really interesting discussions, probably too much for this afternoon. But can I open the floor for questions and asking any of our speakers, or anyone who wants to make a comment, or any of our speakers who would like to make a comment on some of the other presentations that they've heard. So any questions or even a comment on any of the issues?
Maybe a question for you, Matthew. My question would be only to contextualize just a bit about environmental law, not nature rights precisely. You are following the development in the region. You are focusing particularly on the northern part of the region, or you follow what happens in all Southeast Asia? And if so, can you give us a brief picture of how it is going at the regional level? If you compare the different national contexts, which country would be more advanced into the protection of our environment, and what would be the fields that are more protected than the other? Is it a maritime environment or forest, or just very broad contextualization?
I think from a very broad contextualization, there are two things. One is that, and as the United Nations has often identified, we have enough laws. Every country in Southeast Asia has laws that are mostly about environmental protection. Singapore and Brunei less, but Most have forest protection laws that protect forestry or really manage forest issues. Almost all have environmental impact assessment laws to manage how they deal with potential impacts on the environment. Most countries have, all countries in ASEAN have laws about biodiversity protection. All countries have very strong laws about CITES and trading endangered species. So all of these issues are by and large addressed under national laws, in terms of a tick to say that they're done. But as was pointed out in Thailand has some very, very strong laws about protection and anti-animal cruelty, but none of those issues are necessarily reflected in other people's laws. Countries that have the most complete suite of laws can include countries like Vietnam and Laos, PDR. But in terms of enforcement and compliance, they're at the very low end of the scale. And I think that's also where, within the context of Thailand, we do see that there is a lot more enforcement of those environmental protection laws, the laws against cruelty to animals, some of the, obviously, domestic animals, issues about elephant abuse and elephant concerns. But you compare that with the fact that there is virtually no regulation in Thailand of elephant parks. It's all sort of self-regulated. And that, of course, has huge consequences and had huge consequences during COVID. Perhaps one of the most challenging countries, though, in the moment is also Indonesia. And again, Indonesia has some very progressive laws. It also has a law under the National Environmental Protection Law that says that under Article 69, I think it is, any person who is advocating peacefully to protect the environment shall not be subject to any charge, a civil or criminal charge. So it's a way of saying we're going to protect those who are trying to work on environmental issues. Again, if you talk to environmental activists within those countries, they would say that's not a law that's often being looked at. And I should then, and the point about the SLAPP suits, the suits against public participation, everywhere in Southeast Asia, defamation and trespass can be both civil cases and criminal cases, and many people, private sector corporations, are using criminal defamation to attack both reporters and activists, and so they're being prosecuted for criminal defamation, which means it's the same level that they've defamed if caused harm to character, but because it's a criminal case, they can be arrested and detained before the action is heard. And so that is a way that many journalists in particular are being threatened, because what they publish they can defend, but the criminal defamation law and procedure doesn't take into account that it was published in a newspaper. So this, I think, gets back to the point that was very well made by Mike, in terms of you can have these laws, but if they're not enforced, or people are, and in particular corporations, are using other aspects of the law to close down the opportunity for this discussion, that's where we get these major areas of conflict. And in Thailand certainly oscillates with the election coming up in January or February, if it happens. We will see a shift, whether it will be opening up or closing. Malaysia looks to be closing the opportunity for people to take action on environmental issues. Indeed, just recently, the Thai authorities are prosecuting a journalist because of something they wrote in Malaysia. And again, the Malaysians, someone in Malaysia, the government regulator in Malaysia, launched a criminal prosecution for defamation by this journalist. And because it was a criminal case, they could then use transboundary criminal procedures to ask the Thai authorities to arrest this journalist when they were leaving Thailand. And of course, you think about that as a transnational issue, that a journalist who wrote something in Malaysia is being prosecuted in Thailand now and having their rights. And that wasn't related to environmental issues, but it's that sort of thing that we see as being really problematic going forward. And the same is true very much in Indonesia about that individuals not being able to put that regulatory spotlight or the spotlight on regulatory activities. I don't know, Rocky, in terms of Philippines or anything, but Mark, did you have any?
I mean, the only thing I'd add to that, just to make it even more depressing, is that even if the governments, even if the businesses are kind of caught, they don't pay up. You know, like the famous case in Thailand of Clitty Creek, which the village is the one that, like in the 1990s, I think, I don't know, someone may know more about it, in the 2000s, they're still battling for compensation, and this is like 30 years later. And the same thing with the gold mine in Loi. They've won 2 or 3 cases, and so the system, even if there's protection there, it's not guaranteed to find justice.
Sorry, Gabrielle. but we can also, I mean, we've also got some access to information, also Stockholm Environment Institute, where we can talk about, you know, the laws and how they're being applied. But partly it's this compliance and enforcement that's the big challenge. And there are some ways where government departments do enforce them, and then there are other areas where there's sort of the no-go. And part of it is trying to promote a general level of enforcement for environmental issues. Needing to do some ideas. So are people happy where they are? I mean, we'll just do. So Rob, you know, we had a bit of a discussion. We've got some questions that are in the agenda, and we thought the 2 questions we would look at for the next maybe 20 minutes or so, 20-25 minutes. The 2 questions are the second and third one. What research is needed for environmental rights of nature for the ASEAN region? And that may also be, if you are doing research and you want to share the topic that you're researching, that's also quite valuable. And then we can look at perhaps some ideas on strategies or action points. And, you know, sometimes, and I think that in your presentation, you know, some of the things that we could take out from that is looking at how some of these issues about listings or even issues of migratory birds or certain things, how we can bring some of that to more attention. I mean, for me and Rocky as environmental lawyers, one of the things that I think we've learned today is just how much discussion, is how much research has already been done on issues of rights of nature and broadly conceptions behind that. And it may have been, you know, more in Europe or more with some connections within the human rights areas. But it's certainly not something that there's been a lot of academic research from the environmental law perspective. So that has been, I think, quite interesting for our point of view. As we say, within the things that we know are going to happen next year, will be the development of this regional action plan for the implementation of the declaration, as we call it, the Declaration on Environmental Rights, but it's the Declaration on the Right to a Clean, Healthy, Safe and Sustainable Environment. So there will be that. We have no idea if there are funding strategies engaged. So at the moment, that's also a challenge. We do know that there are opportunities for broader stakeholder engagement that perhaps haven't been seen before. And so these are all things that we're really interested in, and more importantly, accessing, you know, the extraordinary researchers who IRASEC, and how we can bring that network of researchers also into that, a bit more of the policy and law side, and how also ASEAN is going to actually respond to environmental rights. So that's why I thought, you know, we could start just on sort of, you know, what research is needed or what research is being done, you know, that you know of that would help on this discussion of those broad topic, rights of nature. Although we've had obviously some interesting ideas on how we frame that rights of nature debate. But if anyone would like to sort of share what research or what they're doing, or thoughts about what we could do.
Should we do that this morning? Like we gather physically together, so we do that.
If you would like to gather, come closer. We're all very friendly. I know some of us are lawyers, but and I was thinking if, as Julien said, when they eat the otolan with the covering because they know it's a sin, perhaps that's one of the things we could do for wildlife trafficking, is to say, well, it's okay if you're trafficking wildlife or eat endangered species, but you have to wear some cover to know that it is a sin or something bad. But you know, it's the concept of sin in Buddhism, the same as sin as in tradition. Yeah, please.
Regarding research, what kind of research would you like to see more salience about these issues? Catherine was talking about the regimes of knowledge, and in this regard it's particularly needed, I think, to have different kind of participatory approaches to address these regimes of knowledge. So with IRASEC here, and with different partners, particularly Chulalongkorn, in the same room, we organized a couple of months ago a two-day workshop on the participatory approaches in Southeast Asia. And we could see that it was impossible to have a single methodology, and that case by case we had to design the collaborative approaches. Catherine also gave a lecture, and then maybe a couple of lectures on this topic in Chiang Mai University and here also. So maybe it would be the first idea that had come in mind to think about how to develop collaborative, co-constructive, co-creative approaches on the relationship between nature, humans, and other elements of the environment.
So I may say something that I think that so I'm not working with the law approach at all. I'm working more with educational point of view. And if policies are evolving in Asia and Southeast Asia, I think it's important to show that government have a duty towards education. Because if you want to have something working at the local scale, you have to educate people and to provide education. So I think it's an important duty for the government. So if there is an act, I hope this will appear somewhere in the act.
So it's the other way around, right? It's not a participatory approach, but it's a way to give from expert or researchers knowledge to the wider public.
Not necessarily researcher, but to provide the information at the local scale. So because if you keep the knowledge in an expert community or in lawyers, you will have no effective results on the problem.
If I can, on the educational approach, because I had the experience with a teacher and researcher from Malaysia. She wanted to improve the education to the environment, training the teachers to be better to teach the science of environment. And one of the research or the approach is to see what kind of teaching deliver these teachers related to where they come from. If they are coming from urban area or they are coming from rural area. Because there is a very big difference between these people in the way they grow up. They don't have the same interaction with the environment, and when they grow up in urban environment, they will not provide the same kind of knowledge or approach of what is environment to their students. And the same way that the people who are in rural area and experience like harvesting crops or going to fish themselves when they are kids, everything, they will not have the same approach to present the facts to the student or even to the way of teaching between workshops or more magistral teaching. So I think it's something very important to see here that the more you have people who are coming from the urban area and more capitalist system, the more they will provide a vision of the environment that will be extractivist environment, extractivist model for the environment.
From this educational point of view, I think that there are many interesting experiences that exist already, even in Thailand. Because for water issue, for instance, you have these Mekong schools where the people are trying to focus on young generations to get them more knowledge about their environment and especially about rivers. And so they do already a lot of work and coming from them and not from scholars and saying that we should educate people on this. So I think that what is interesting here is that to make visible what is already existing in the countries, because I think that there are many, many, many interesting experiences, but we don't see them. I mean, Mekong school, they are very visible because Kuti is very famous, so everyone knows this experience. But there are many others.
But the point is these people, maybe they will not be the leaders of the country later. It's not the same people, you know. And I think that's the problematic. In fact, the one who will rule will be disconnected from nature and see the nature as resources that they can extract. When these people, they can be connected to their environment, know it well. I think the problem here is more like we need to reverse.
Kuti got a prize, environmental prize. He's very visible now. So what he's doing is influencing a lot of people, leader people also. So I don't know. I think that we need just to be aware that there are many things that are happening in countries and that we need to analyze this as scholars. You know what I mean? Just to see and to what's happening, but starting from the ground.
And to spread it. To spread it.
I don't know.
The practices.
I'm not a great fan of this idea of upscaling, because I think that it's very contextualized each time. So I'm not for the success stories that then you can tell everywhere in the world. This is not my way of thinking. So I think that there are good experiences, that sharing experiences from south to south, this is what I'm trying to do, and I found this very interesting, but not to try to find out success stories.
If you don't want to upscale it, what are the elements then that you can spread to the other, like a methodology or something to work like this, to bring more pedagogic program or more system of interaction between indigenous knowledge that could be shown to the kids or even to the teacher, because most of the teachers they will not even survive in the forest. So what would be the methodology to bring them to share or to receive the knowledge?
I don't want to...
No, but just the methodology.
Okay, so when you organize workshop with only people from the global south, but with different people coming from different countries, for instance. And I mean not only from Asia. For instance, when you put together people from Africa and Asia, it's very interesting because they share their own experiences. And then they are the one who decide what they would share, what is... sorry, I'm so tired now because I cannot find my new words. But you know what I mean now? I don't know how to express in English. But I think that, you know, for instance, in France we have this idea of living labs where you try to figure out how it would work out when all the people from different perspectives are all together and how they co-elaborate some tools, for instance. So this is the kind of thing that we are trying to do, but not in the idea of getting success stories. Because you know the World Bank and all these big organizations, when they finance your projects, they just ask you one thing. Please identify success stories that we can replicate everywhere. You know, I'm used to this. So I'm trying to get rid of this and try to do something else.
But this is quite, I mean, for me, again, it's quite interesting because you can celebrate success for its success, but it's a local context. It's not success for replication.
But what does that mean, success, you know?
But partly this is also how things are defined as successful by funders, as opposed to success by communities. Because and again, I think this is the lawyer's problem we have, is that when you're advising governments or organisations on law, you're doing so usually at a national level or a state level. So, and all lawyers or all advocates will use an example to show this can be successful. But that might be a problem, especially when it comes to some of these environmental rights and
In fact, it depends on the founders. Just let me tell you a story. We are funded by a water agency in France. Okay, they put a lot of money for water governance everywhere, in Africa, Asia, everywhere. So they were asking us as researchers, okay, it doesn't work. But you know, the founder will just say that. What's the first step for a different way of thinking? So, and they say, okay, if you just explain to us that we don't do the right things on the field, it's okay. So for the last 6 years, we documented different experiences at a local level that are quite interesting to document. And we bring that to this water agency in France. This is a national level, water agencies there. So this is the impact on the way that they are formulated their rules and the way they finance the projects. It has an impact today, after 6 years, a long time. But and I found this experience very interesting. And it's not only local, just to document local, but it's just to show to these founders that what's happening at the local level, so making it visible. Some works, some doesn't work, to be very transparent and not idealization of community level management, water management. That's the point. You see? So it has also an impact at the national level for French water agency. It's a public national level. So, but it takes time. It's not the logic of the 2-3 years project management. That's a big difference.
I'm sorry, I think that maybe you did not understand well my point. By education, I was thinking things more similar to what is done under the model of Natura 2000. So where you have a local contract of objectives regarding biodiversity, and for reaching the contract of objectives, you have several items, you have legal items, but you have also educational items. And I think that, okay, so I'm not sure that this is a good idea to move the European model to here, but the Natura 2000 model was successful because it's an alternative to national park. and it was helping very much to monitor what was undergoing with biodiversity in Europe. And for this, at least the program was successful.
I was going to ask Paul. Did you want to sort of say something about some of the work you're doing on elephants as well? Because I think that would be good. And the organisation.
I mean, I'm not really sure what I'm about to say is relevant. However, I have some experience when it comes to funders' expectation. And unfortunately, that funders is just pulled out, partly because they're funded, well, not partly, but mainly the US government, and I don't want to get into the nuance of that. However, the funders expect us to engage quite a significant numbers of people, particularly with farmers. I work with Woodbury community. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that. It is about 4.5 hours away from Bangkok. And what the funders wanted is that they wanted farmers to plant alternative crops. Crops that elephants don't eat. And they wanted crops that elephants don't eat because the farmers there plant a lot of pineapple, and they live with about 237 wild elephants. The funders were like, well, if we give you a certain amount of money, we want at least 100 to 200 in the beginning, but it turns out that we can only do 50 maximum. But at the end of the day, we weren't able to do that, and there was a lot of hurdles just trying to get to 50 farmers, and they had to pull out. And with this information that I've given, I don't know if there's any questions that I can clearly answer, because I wasn't really prepared to give any answer, but I can talk to you about how we did it, the research, the outcomes, and the challenges when it comes to satisfying the funders. Thank you.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about this project was it was about human-elephant conflict and trying to, in Thailand, to try and avoid conflict by looking at a range of issues, but one was planting crops that elephants didn't eat. But the challenge was, that's the theory, the challenge was in practice, the community said, well, we want to plant crops that will make us money. And we had to deal with the elephant-human conflict, which is still ongoing though. I mean, it's still, and I think we heard, that there is still these challenges there. So, I mean, maybe that's a research project. So one of the issues that we have is the idea of, do we still need more research on some of these issues about human-wildlife conflict? Is that an area of concern? I mean, is this something that is prevalent in other countries like Indonesia? Obviously, in Cambodia, it must be relevant with elephants. But in other countries, the conflict, the human-wildlife conflict, is that as relevant? But
if I may add, does research is needed? Yes and no, I would say. But what's more important is community engagement, or what we would call stakeholder engagement. And I work with them very closely. I'm dressed like this, but most of the time when I work with communities, I'm in my shorts and my pajamas, and I talk to them in their little house with roofs leaking or no aircon, no construction like this. So I feel for them a lot. But then when it comes to satisfying, funders' expectation, and we cannot meet them, there are many reasons involving why we cannot deliver what they wanted. It's just not their livelihoods. The funders have a very strange expectation sometimes, and how I see it is just consumer buying a certain product. And for us as service provider, when we cannot deliver that, it's kind of understandable for them to pull the fund out. But I really wish that they would understand the struggles that these communities are facing. And it's not easy. They've been there for at least 50 years, and government, private sector, and NGOs like myself, with my other organizations, we try really hard to just mitigate the issues of human-elephant conflict in one particular area. But at the end of the day, it's just very difficult because resources are limited, and funder satisfaction is very difficult to deliver. And but I think what's very important is stakeholder engagement. I don't want people to be seen as just numbers, because these numbers that certain researchers or funders see, they have families, they have feelings, they have emotions, just like us. But sometimes they've been neglected, which is unfortunate. Thank you.
Who are the founders?
US Fish and Wildlife Service.
Sorry, is that the US government, yeah? Okay. So, sorry, on that point, can I ask, on, let's say, the funding situation, right? If there are like situations that were, you could say, that went better, maybe with local governmental funding, maybe with like environmental indigenous people, maybe the Sami people in Norway, Taiwanese indigenous people and stuff, do they have that kind of problem too with international development funding versus local government funding? Thank you. Anyone, sorry.
Yeah. Does anyone have experience with funding? I think most funders here probably, most people get funding here from government institutes, or I know that the collapse in the USAID funding from an environmental perspective, including the work they were doing on transnational wildlife crime and anti-corruption, we haven't seen the full extent of the damage and the harm that that's caused. But no other country is actually wanting to step up to support that. In fact, I don't know who is doing the majority of funding of research in Southeast Asia in terms of applied research, I think, in terms of more Sweden. SEI.
Sweden and Canada. But, to a certain extent, if the funders are that bad, just don't take the funding. You don't really have a choice. You could say, well, that this project is going down this way, I'm not going to do it. And that's why, we used to work with USAID because of the restrictions on that. And, that's just the choice that they made. Because most of the funding organisations, they are kind of rights-based, they are well-intentioned, they do, I think we're kind of putting the blame on saying it's funders' fault, and really, it's
But I think this is perhaps something that must have come out of your previous conference in terms of that point about making sure that they are focused on community expectations and community. But I'm not sure how that. And so if we're thinking about what research projects we think should be done on rights of nature, and we're saying that they should be focused on a community engagement, is that a different modality for projects, or have you already developed that modality that you can help us go out to try and find more projects?
Can I just give a couple of suggestions of areas? This is from some recent interesting research. And a couple of people in researching on migration and refugees, the impact on the environment. And I think that's important because we tend to focus on the same old characters like the farmers and indigenous groups and so on, which is important, but they've already had funding. But this research looking at, particularly in Bangladesh, when the Rohingya came along, 1.2 million or whatever, huge impact in terms of the natural environment, in terms of species, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of waste, and all that kind of stuff. And the humanitarian organisations, again, very well-meaning, but really struggling to what can we do with this environmental impact. And these researchers are trying to look at what are the systems and mechanisms of doing that, at the level of the NGO, at the level of the international, does the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, does that, and how does that address refugees in terms of the reporting? So there's so much missed out on that. And so there are those groups of those research of some groups like that. Even things like, say, inner city groups, informal settlements, which are under research in terms of the impact on the environment. So I think there are these groups that are under researched. Another one I think is important to research is extraterritoriality, that nature doesn't obey borders, neither does wildlife. And so how do we look at the rights to nature in a world where laws may be sovereign, whereas the nature itself is not going to be sovereign? With business, there's some movements towards that. With kind of international crime, there's movements towards that around universal jurisdiction. but how does that fit into the right of nature? And I think another third important one, and again, we've got some researchers working on this, and that's the impact and conflict, particularly conflict in Myanmar, on the environment. Because it happens in a range of ways. Of course, we've got the rare earth mining, and we've got just a lack of rule of law. Suddenly means that people start poaching a lot more, they're overfishing, because the internal infrastructure is broken down, and that often they do rely on overfishing in their rivers or doing bad kind of farming practice because they can't get good quality stuff. And so the conflict has so many diverse impacts on the environment, which is just not done because no one can kind of research, or there's so little researchers who want to research in conflict situations.
So I just in terms of, for us, bringing it back to some of the things that, for the environmental rights declaration, that one of the things that ASEAN did commit to is to promote and foster environmental education in ASEAN to enhance public awareness on promoting and protecting the rights for a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment. So it's clearly an issue. And this is also something that I've just been doing this project in Laos through Agence Française de Développement. And Laos has a law dissemination department that actually does disseminate their obligation, or their mandate is to disseminate law, and so they've developed some activities to disseminate the environmental law and the environmental laws of Laos to local communities and villages. Again, it's the question for what purpose. But at least I think the issue of environmental education is something that we can raise as part of the action plan and make it more central. And I think that is not only communicating to communities, but also environmental education in schools as well as universities.
But that already exists in the Convention on Biological Diversity. They are legally, as a part of that convention, part of that, one of those elements is environmental education. So it already exists there, even in terms, you can say, with human rights education. So it's not like it's this new thing. It's been around for a while, but they haven't been doing it.
So Rocky, the next sort of question we want to look at is some of the strategic or the strategies questions.
Sure, thanks, Matthew. I think some of them have been tackled on the research side on education, especially exchange of ideas as well as funding, but I wanted to go specifically to this question on strategies, on how to recognize or implement or ensure public awareness for rights of nature going forward. So I'd like to get your thoughts on more action points, what specific tangible action points we can do together moving forward to recognize more this initiative on rights of nature and the research that people have been doing as well. So this could include, for instance, platforms that you know of that could disseminate this information and research further, other opportunities as well, maybe events that you may know of in the coming years, as well as maybe communications and advocacy strategies as well. Framing is good. I think that has come up again and again the whole day on how to frame things so that it's picked up more by governments or any other party stakeholders that we may have. Maybe funding opportunities as well. So those are the things. Maybe two things in particular: how we connect it to the policy side with government initiatives at the regional level as well as at the national level. If there are reforms and legislation pending on these things, there might be opportunities there as well. But at the ASEAN level, since we have these developments at the ASEAN level for environmental rights, there are opportunities there we will see as well. So happy to get your thoughts on these tangible strategies that we can think of as we start to bring this conversation to rights of nature more better in this framework. Yeah. our communications people.
SEI.
SEI.
I definitely don't have much knowledge on what's available as like a comprehensive platform in the context of Asia specifically, but at the global level, there are two website/platform. One is called Eco Jurisprudence Monitor that tracks the rights of nature cases across both political jurisdiction and then also across geographical jurisdiction, and they also define that within their own website. There's another one by Columbia Law Center, Columbia University Law Center. I'm trying to see if I can find the name. I think it is called Right to. I will try to find the name and then revert back to you. And there's also the International Tribunal on Rights of Nature, managed by a U.S. NGO, GARN, that's been working a lot on the local cases in the context of the U.S. especially. So it's a forum. It's definitely not an official tribunal like the Green Tribunal like India has, but it is a forum where people have been trying to bring up the issues of rights of nature in the case of Americas, so both like Northern and Latin America. So that's some of those resources that I need.
Thanks, Dayoon. Please, go ahead.
I have a very naive question. When you are talking about strategy of communication, do you work with a huge company of advertising? Because it's them who have the strategic planner, right?
Well, for us, since we've been in the context of environmental rights, we work a lot with, it's mostly NGOs and youth groups and indigenous peoples groups, so we don't have the resources as like strategic planning for communications and all those, so there are limitations. But we do have a lot of communications experts that we can tap, and I think this is something that we can also look at in terms of rights of nature. We just need to have a more clear strategy on how we want to frame it, and that's what I want also to listen from everyone here, like how do we frame the rights of nature going forward, especially in this region, since I noticed that in other regions there's actually a lot of conversations flowing, a lot more conversations flowing, I think, than in America. But in Southeast Asia, it's not a lot. It's very, nascent. So I think, like, as this is starting, what would be the right way, or like, what would be a suggestion on how we frame it, especially with the government's, issue on like prioritizing economics, rather than nature protection in many jurisdictions. So that might be something that we can also discuss.
I'm an anthropologist, and for me these questions are quite abstract because in anthropology we work at a small scale, and education and knowledge construction are not totally divided. So it's because we do participatory research, then the people can contribute to the production of knowledge, and then it will automatically flow for educational purpose, because people are engaged, so they will appropriate more easily the results of the research. So research and education are not totally dissociated in these terms. So what we would recommend, I think, for this kind of small-scale approaches are to do field visits, give the voice to diverse people, to explain their experiences, taking into account legitimacy of the people within a community. taking also into account whether they are representative of everyone or not, or only a segment of the population. So these are complex positionalities of the people within the communities that we have to take into account to know whether their voice will be heard, by whom, at which moment also. So it's really, it has to be really qualitative in the sense that it has to be detailed, tailored. And also the nature rights have to be thought by taking into consideration the integration of lifestyles, livelihoods within the specific territory. So difficult to have an approach, a top-down approach, and to replicate it. But at least we can upscale by seeing different principles, which are integration of lifestyles within a specific environment. If people are aware of that dimension, maybe they can be more comprehensive approach in other fieldwork. So these kind of very general principles maybe should be conveyed for the general population, the general public.
Thanks, Gavin. Yeah.
The big question there is what's the audience, because the message, basically all that the message is going to be determined by the audience. And so if you're talking about influencing government, then you do something like the soothing or strategic litigation, because that's going to get their attention, of course. But if it's like general education and the youth, then it'll be through the education system. And that's why, like in Thailand, you've got that the environmental activist who killed himself about the wildlife. That kind of thing, yeah. Which is really successful because almost all kids in Thailand have heard about him and they've visited that. And so and that's really successful in terms of that's their first kind of take on environmental rights. He was a park ranger who was trying to protect the animals against poaching, and he kind of was frustrated and I think he killed himself. But this is like in the early 90s, but then there was a foundation set up. It was all quite famous, but I'm sure when you guys were in school, you would have been taught him at school, which means that in terms of things like but now, like undergraduate students, I know we talk about that in terms of environment, like that's their kind of entry point into it. And so you need something like that, something like that where it can kind of enter into the curriculum of high schools, and that's the kind of the mainstream one. But if it is looking at NGOs, then it's going to be a different strategy. If it is going to be looking at governments, but there's going to be 3 or 4 different messages according to what the audience is.
Sorry, I fully agree with that, because I think at the end of the day, if this does reach the masses is the people that have the power to change this, right? If there's a movement. So it's actually like quite important that general education and global awareness of these issues are preached to the masses, and the masses actually understand them to a certain level so that they can have informed decisions, whether it's politics, business. The next generation can do things differently than the last generation, right? So I think it's really important. Thank you.
In Indonesia also, for instance, the religious groups, they play a very important role to convey education, particularly environmental education. So there are big religious organizations, Muslim organizations, notably, who are engaged for environmental struggles. I think that in Thailand we could find also equivalent figures or networks, organizations could be mobilized.
Yeah, sorry. Can I ask a question? Does anyone know of any Islamic organizations that have been doing sort of research on environmental protection and obligations under the Quran? I'm thinking about this because I know we work in the Philippines when John Paul II, did the encyclical in the Laudato Si, the Philippine Catholic groups were very, very supportive of this because it talked about the relationship from a Catholic tradition with the environment. There's been a lot of discussions, I think, in the Buddhist community about that. Obviously, not always successful. And I know that when Pakistan judgment in the Islamabad High Court held that there was an obligation of all citizens of Pakistan to act to protecting animals and the environment, they firmly focused that on the Quran, and they firmly focused that on religious and ethical obligations, not just on the law. And I know that this is something that has been examined a little bit. We get some funding from the United States, and we talk about engaging faith-based groups in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and they go, we don't engage with the religious movements in America. And we say, well, you can't not engage with the religious groups in Southeast Asia and the Pacific because they do have such a strong engagement here. But yeah, does anyone know any specific research?
I hope I'm not saying in a biased perspective because I'm an alumni from one university in Indonesia, and it's coming from Islamic organization movement called Muhammadiyah. So Muhammadiyah is one of the biggest organizations in Indonesia, along with Nahdlatul Ulama or NU. So this organization has established several educational institutions, and then hospitals, and all levels of educations, from kindergarten to the university level, not just in Indonesia but also in Australia, Taiwan, Malaysia, and I forgot another one. So they've been doing a research intensively, seeing the perspective of how the Islamic religion is seeing the animal welfare and also the environmental protections, but not just coming from the so-called Bible or Quran, but we kind of do some comparative studies. So I was one of the researchers at the time, and we are just waiting for publication, which is a long way to go. The title is Reframing Animal Welfare in Indonesia, Religious Ethics as a Legal Normative Framework. Because we see that, I think we've been talking in the first group earlier that in Indonesia, animal is more like property, and environment is also property as well. So it's kind of a little bit challenging to see that Indonesian government, in a way that they have the highest authority to see how the nature should be governed, is not seeing from the multi-perspectives. So the Muhammadiyah Research Center, Muhammadiyah Studies Research Center, we've been initiating a research on the how we are trying to integrate the Islamic values and also other religions values as well, including all 6 constitutionally acknowledged in Indonesia, including Hindu, Buddhist, we have Catholic, we have Protestant, and also Confucianism and Islam. So we have 6 acknowledged, but we actually have a lot more because there are some more like indigenous-based belief or religion, if I may say that. So I think it's not purely coming from the perspective of Islam per se, but also trying to reach the points where welfare, compassion toward the environment is actually written in all religions. And we are trying to inform the government as the closest stakeholder, that being hope that they can listen, I hope they can, to see that we have so many backgrounds in terms of religions, and that we have so many good values in it, and not trying to make something or make one specific religion to be like superior, which is just Islam. So that's why Muhammadiyah is trying to facilitate the so-called interfaith religion-based toward how we protect the animal and more like broader perspective of the environmental protections.
Thanks. No, that's really great, very relevant to Southeast Asia and the Pacific in particular. That's plan equipment again. But then just going back to the discussion on strategy, I understand that this is an initial conversation. If you want to make a whole strategy, you don't have to take days to develop people. But just some initial thoughts on how to start on these things, especially in education is one for the public awareness and start them young with the curriculum. But going to the governments, and if we target policy at the government, you mentioned strategic litigation, but in many jurisdictions there might not be any basis or cause of action for this litigation to take place in the first place. So what might be our approach to governments for policy reform, for instance, for rights of nature? Do you have any thoughts on that? Especially now that it's the might not be a flavor of many of our governments, and they always say that let's not floodgates, but it never happens.
Yeah, like I'm always a little bit more pessimistic about coming across as such a grumpy old guy. But governments in the region have kind of reached policy saturation in terms of that stuff. Everyone comes with things to do, and so it's really challenging. Because again, like a lot of donors say that we want your work to kind of have impact with governments. That all these kind of poor researchers are then trying to push off their research, and the government officers aren't really that interested. And that's why kind of contacts like that, which is directly towards them, don't tend to work, because that is flooded in the kind of the policy and the interest groups and so on. And given that you're not really going to be able to compete with corporations or people with money, that you do need some kind of alternative strategy. And it's true, like strategic litigation, I kind of said that as a bit of a joke. Like, it would be nice if it works, but really, it's extremely difficult and extremely dangerous things to do. You need something which is kind of a bit more attention grabbing, and it's not like, I think you kind of have to go from the outside rather than trying to get from the inside. But that's the pessimistic view.
Not too pessimistic.
I like to think it's realistic, but like the other tactics is there's always like one good person in many of those organisations. And we know there are, like even the Thai government in some industries, there's always that one good person who's the contact there.
And you, what is the strategy you developed so far?
Yeah, thanks. We're still working on that one. But again, part of it is that from a lawyer, you always look at normative instruments, whether they're binding or non-binding. Again, in some respects, the Charter, the Human Rights Charter, is a non-binding document because it doesn't have clear obligations for us as individuals, because we're the rights holders. And I think that was where one of Ramchat's comments earlier, that we need to look at the consequences of environmental rights as being more of a coexistence, because nature can't owe an obligation for its existence. We recognise that. Human and wildlife conflict is a consequence of us accepting that nature has an intrinsic value. In Australia, for example, the issue of meshing of beaches to prevent shark attacks is obviously as challenging as issues of bears in Slovenia or wolves in Slovenia and Slovakia. The increase, once you protect animals that have a predatory instinct, you then have consequences. And again, it's all that management of consequences. Issues of elephant protection in countries where there are elephant ranges, but again, partly it's because of the destruction of elephant habitats, and also because of the changing consequence of climate. And I think, Bob and I have talked about this in terms of elephants coming out of national parks, where they were, because they don't want to go to the national parks, they don't check their visas to say, please go in the national park. They want to go, they don't recognise that they're crossing borders, and that then leads to conflict. So for us, part of the strategy is, because we have been working at a regional level, and with the declaration, we need to move forward with the plan of action. But I think we also can recommit to the idea of a stronger, more binding environmental rights framework, but we still look at that from a procedural right. The substantive elements for a right to environment all deal with things that humans need, and so it is still very much focused on human rights. So then this idea is also how we can change the narrative is still quite important, and it's something I think we will still be working on, because I also know that within the context of business and human rights, a number of commitments that people have made, governments in Southeast Asia and elsewhere have been made on them, haven't been followed through, which then gets back to that enforcement and compliance, as well as that policy overload that obviously governments are having. So these are challenges. Sorry, Julien.
No, I was listening to you and I was thinking, so I will not I will probably make myself enemy, so not, I don't care. We were not speaking about demography, and if you look at animal demography and human demography, it's not the same. And I think that if I was an elephant, I would probably ask for reducing human demography, because the conflict with human does not appear, because elephant demography is increasing. Actually, it's stable. It's because human demography is increasing, economy is increasing, our needs are increasing, and I think always that we prefer to be like this when it's about that question of demography, because it's linked to plenty of things, our instinct as animals, as well our aim to always win against nature, and sorry to think that there will be no good right for nature if there is no control of human development.
So on that, and I think we will draw today to a close. But I do want to thank IRASEC, Jeremy and Gabrielle, for hosting us here, and the Political Science Department, because this is the first time I've been involved in a discussion on the rights of nature. When we first started the initial discussion documents for the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and for Professor Amara Ponsapic, who was the then time representative, one of the things that they said quite clearly is that there will be no discussion on the rights of nature, there will be no discussion on animal rights. This is a human rights instrument. They then said that we should be ambitious, and we were, but the ambition was not necessarily continued for the full duration of the declaration process. But one of the things it did show is that there was a lot of resistance to the concept of non-human rights, issues of biodiversity rights, and even just those issues of environmental protection. But one thing that I think I've also noticed in the 14 years I've been in Thailand and working in the region, taking into account the coups as well as the Myanmar coup, but also the destabilisation elsewhere, as Rocky pointed out, one of the great challenges is also the environmental defenders, because it's becoming more and more difficult for them and us to argue for environmental protection in a policy and legislative space, which is why research and science is still very important to base some arguments to governments for change and for action. But that challenging need for protection of environmental and human rights defenders has been recognised by ASEAN. And Edmund Bond, who is the current chair until the end of the year, is the delegate from Malaysia, has been very strong in suggesting that maybe the ICHA should consider establishing some formal mechanism in ASEAN to deal with some of the complaints against violation of rights of environmental defenders. That's something that the Aarhus Convention of the Economic Commission for Europe did, and Michel Forster is the first special rapporteur on environmental and human rights defenders, covering 44 different countries in the Economic Commission for Europe. And it's been quite successful and important to highlight challenges. His first report was actually against the United Kingdom for its jailing of climate change protesters, something that in Australia they're also doing. Australian jails its climate change protesters harsher than any other country in the world, including Saudi Arabia, including China, and including the United Kingdom. And so that's was going to be one of the interesting things, that Australia had been successful in being a host of the climate conference of parties. is recognising that Australia is doing that in circumstances where its laws at state level are often more draconian than any other country in the world. And that's a key issue for Australia, but it's also something that we hope other countries in the region don't learn. For us, from ARIA's perspective, we've been really excited to be here, to be able to start this, hopefully, this partnership, but also learn about some of the extraordinary things that are happening, to consider how we can move some of the philosophical debate, some of the interesting arguments that have been developed into that more ASEAN space, which can be challenging with that focus on the right to development, but also on this approach that ASEAN has adopted, which is ASEAN-led and ASEAN-owned. Despite these things being universal, indivisible, they still have to have an ASEAN flavour, and one of the things that is discussed a lot is the ASEAN consensus. But as we often argued with our colleagues on the ASEAN Continuing Commission on Human Rights, you had to have the discussion in order to reach a consensus. If it didn't allow us to have the stakeholder engagement and the discussion, we could never reach a consensus. And so this is also the challenge that we face, certainly with the Regional Action Plan, but certainly I think going forward into trying to work out how we maximise environmental protection and consider those issues of the rights of nature and the challenging ideas that have also been raised today. So on behalf of ARIA, I really want to say thank you very much for your participation, and hopefully this was the beginning of some conversations. And I can now turn it over to Jeremy.
Thank you very much, and yes, so very quickly to express my deep gratitude to everybody, to the quality of the session. Sometimes, yes, at the end we have a kind of pessimistic note and realistic at the same way. I think it's good to be realistic, although we are driven by utopian, of course, ideas, which is good. It's how we change the world. I've noticed some lines, of course, of optimism through this predatorian, we say, world. We're talking about this. So thank you for this. Very happy to invite you and to continue the discussion and maybe to have other utopian ideas and a realistic one as well. And also go to update your LinkedIn, also maybe, and put some hashtag, some governments, some ASEAN members, ministries. I think 99% of our leaders are now spending most of hours every day on social networks. If you want to touch them, it's the only way, actually, I think. Really, actually the shortest way and most impactful way. So, for instance, what we have a kind of post after this event, and although the other event that we have mentioned, it's good to keep them aware that we are here and we are observing what they are doing, and we try to change and to give voice to people who don't have the chance to express it. So thank you again.